September 19th, 1944. The morning fog clings to the broken fields east of Arracourt. Silence drapes the countryside. Only the slow ticking of a weary engine breaks it. A Sherman tank, its olive paint scorched and flaked by weeks of battle, sits half-sunk in mud. The barrel bears scars of near misses. The hull, patched with welded steel plates cut from wrecks. Its crew, 5 exhausted Americans, sip black coffee from tin cups, listening to the faint crackle of a German transmission intercepted the night before. They'd heard the laughter. German tankers mocking them as rust buckets, unworthy opponents for the mighty Panthers rolling in from the east. But under the morning fog, those rust buckets still breathe. The gunner wipes grime from his scope. The loader tightens his gloves. And in the turret, their commander whispers the same word he's spoken every morning since Normandy. Ready. Across the field, unseen in the mist, dozens of German engines ignite. The ground trembles. The final test of the Sherman's endurance and its crew's resolve is about to begin. By the late summer of 1944, the Allies had broken free from the beaches of Normandy and were driving relentlessly eastward across France. The breakout, known as Operation Cobra, had transformed the once stalemated front into a thunderous pursuit. German forces disorganized and retreating, left behind thousands of wrecks, tanks, half-tracks, and guns scattered along the roads of Brittany and Normandy. Leading this chase was General George S. Patton's U.S. Third Army, a force defined by its speed, aggression, and audacity. In less than a month it had advanced hundreds of miles, liberating cities and cutting deep into German defenses. Yet success came with a price. The very pace that gave Patton's army its legend also stretched it to its limit. Fuel was scarce, tanks were overused, and the long supply lines back to Normandy creaked under constant strain. Among the spearhead units was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by the hard-driving Major General John S. Wood. Within it, the 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, had earned a reputation for ferocity. Abrams' men often found themselves leading the charge and paying for it with their machines. Their Shermans were veterans of countless engagements, battered by shrapnel and road dust, repaired again and again by exhausted mechanics who welded armor from scrap metal and scavenged parts from the dead. As the front pushed toward the German border, the terrain of Lorraine changed everything. Gone were the open fields of Normandy. Here the landscape turned deceptive. Rolling hills, narrow valleys, and endless fog. Villages like Arracourt, Rechicourt, and Lizy dotted the countryside, each becoming a landmark of fire and steel. By early September, Patton's momentum began to slow. Rain turned the roads into sludge. Fuel convoys struggled to keep pace. The Third Army's advance stalled just west of the Moselle River, and for the first time in weeks, German High Command saw an opening. The 5th Panzer Army, newly reformed under General Hasso von Manteuffel, was ordered to strike back. Composed largely of fresh armored divisions re-equipped with the formidable Panther tanks, it was to cut through Patton's thin lines, retake Nancy, and push the Americans back to the west. The German plan was audacious. A counterattack through fog, designed to use surprise and superior armor to overwhelm the weary Americans. What they didn't know was that the 4th Armored Division still held the ground around Arracourt, thinly spread, but deeply experienced. They had fought their way across France not through brute strength, but through adaptability. Their inferior Shermans, lighter, less armored, and less armed than the Panthers, had proven their worth not through design, but through the men who fought inside them. For the soldiers of the 37th Tank Battalion, the arrival of the German counterattack meant one thing: survival by ingenuity. Mechanics turned broken-down tanks into decoys. Crews dug in their vehicles, lowering silhouettes against the fog. They plotted every hedgerow and ridge, every road and field where they could ambush the approaching enemy. The rusty Shermans, as the Germans derisively called them, waited. Their engines coughed. Their hulls were scarred and patched, but they were ready. On the evening of September 18th, American radio intercepts caught fragments of German transmissions, words like Panther, Arracourt, fog. It was clear that something massive was coming. Some crews joked that the Germans were finally brave enough to return. Others cleaned their guns in silence. In the command tent, maps spread across wooden tables. Abrams studied the terrain. He knew the Panthers had thicker armor and longer guns, but they were slower, heavier, and struggled on muddy ground. The Lorraine fog, dense and unpredictable, could be the great equalizer. As dawn approached on September 19th, the mist rolled thick across the fields. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. The rumble of German engines grew louder, and in the distance, the first muzzle flashes appeared like lightning through smoke. The Germans believed they were driving straight into a retreating enemy. Instead, they were heading into the jaws of one of the most skillfully executed armored defenses of the entire war. The fog of Lorraine was more than weather. It was a weapon. In the early hours of September 19, 1944, visibility fell to less than 100 meters. The German tank columns of the 111th and 113th Panzer brigades advanced cautiously, engines rumbling, their commanders peering through periscopes into a world of white. What they could not see was that the battlefield ahead of them was already mapped, studied, and prepared by the Americans waiting in silence. For days, the men of the 4th Armored Division had fortified their positions around the small French village of Rechicourt. The region's terrain was deceptive. Low ridges and shallow valleys, crisscrossed by dirt tracks and cornfields. To an inexperienced observer, it looked open and harmless. To a tanker like Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, it was the perfect killing ground. Abrams' battalion had learned from bitter experience. In previous battles, they'd faced German tanks that could destroy a Sherman from nearly twice the distance a Sherman could return fire. But Abrams refused to fight by German rules. Instead of open-field duels, he used concealment, mobility, and surprise. His orders were simple. Don't show yourself until you can kill what you see. The American tankers took those words to heart. The Shermans dug into hedgerows, set ambushes along narrow roads, and used the fog to move undetected. Their radio discipline was tight, their coordination with artillery and reconnaissance constant. Above them, the skies were closed. The weather too poor for the Allied air forces to assist. For now, the tank crews were on their own. The German commanders believed they were facing scattered remnants of Patton's armored spearhead. Many of their soldiers were replacements, young, inexperienced men thrown into new Panther tanks with minimal training. Their machines were powerful but temperamental. Transmissions failed, engines overheated, and many tanks ran out of fuel before even reaching the front. Still, confidence ran high. The Panther was considered one of the most advanced tanks of the war. Sloped armor, a high-velocity 75mm gun, and superior optics. German doctrine taught that a single Panther could destroy several Shermans before being threatened. And in open terrain, that was often true. But Lorraine was not open terrain. As the German spearhead approached Rechicourt, confusion set in. The fog turned every hedgerow into a wall, every sound into a possible ambush. German tank commanders, unable to see more than a few meters ahead, fired blindly at suspected positions. Artillery units struggled to find targets. Coordination between brigades faltered. Then came the first shock. From the mist, a line of Shermans opened fire from a concealed ridge. Their shots tore through the lead Panther column, striking side armor exposed during the slow turn on soft ground. Flames erupted. German tankers, disoriented, fired back. But their long-range advantage was gone. The engagement had turned into close-quarters combat, and in that deadly proximity, speed and coordination mattered more than firepower. Over the next 48 hours, Arracourt became a chaos of steel and smoke. German tanks tried repeatedly to push through, only to be ambushed by small mobile groups of Shermans using terrain as cover. The American crews fought like ghosts, appearing, firing, and vanishing back into the fog. What began as a German counteroffensive soon devolved into a desperate attempt to survive. Units lost radio contact, officers misread maps, and several German formations accidentally fired on their own vehicles. Meanwhile, Abrams' battalion coordinated artillery barrages that landed precisely where the Panthers regrouped. Behind the front, American mechanics worked through the night, patching holes, refueling, and even pulling spare tracks from burned-out wrecks. Tanks that had been declared unfit for battle were dragged back into service, rusty, dented, patched with mismatched armor plates. Yet by dawn each day they were back on the line. To the Germans, these revived machines seemed endless. Every time a Panther believed it had cleared the field, another rusty Sherman emerged from a hedgerow or smoke cloud, firing from a flank or rear position. It was warfare at its rawest, improvised, brutal, intimate, and it was here, in the fog and mud of Lorraine, that the myth of German armored invincibility began to fracture. As the battle dragged into its third day, the Germans realized the Americans were not retreating. They were luring them deeper. The rusty Shermans, dismissed as inferior, had become silent predators in a landscape designed to kill. The soldiers who fought around Arracourt were not fresh recruits or armored parade crews. They were veterans of the hedgerows, men who had seen what a Panzer shell could do to steel and to flesh. By September 1944, many of them had been inside their Shermans for months without a full rest. The tank had become more than a machine. It was a cramped, noisy, half-metal, half-sweat home. Inside one of those Shermans, its armor dull, its engine coughing, sat a 5-man crew of the 37th Tank Battalion. Men like these carried the spirit of the entire division. Their world measured just over 2 meters of space, thick with oil fumes and the metallic sting of gunpowder residue. Each man knew his role so well it was almost instinct. The commander, usually a sergeant or lieutenant, stood half out of the turret, binoculars pressed to his eyes, guiding the crew through the fog. Below him, the gunner and loader worked in rhythm, one sighting and squeezing, the other slamming shell after shell into the breech. The driver and assistant driver kept the tank moving, eyes fixed on a narrow slit of visibility. Communication was everything. When the intercom crackled, it was never small talk, only short, clipped bursts. Target left, range 200, fire. The men inside a Sherman fought not just the enemy, but the machine itself. Heat built up until metal burned through gloves. The smell of cordite mixed with the ever-present risk of gasoline fumes igniting from a single spark. The Sherman's nickname, Ronson, like the lighter, was grimly familiar. Lights every time. Yet, despite its reputation, the Sherman was not the death trap German propaganda claimed. It had weaknesses, thin armor, a tendency to burn when hit, but it had something far more decisive: reliability. While the Panthers and Tigers broke down by the dozens, the Shermans rolled on. When a track snapped, it was fixed. When the engine overheated, mechanics rebuilt it overnight. Technically, the Sherman was never designed to fight head-to-head duels with heavy tanks. It was a medium tank, optimized for maneuver, speed, and ease of production. America built nearly 50,000 of them, each one a piece of mass-produced engineering designed for adaptability. A Sherman could be shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded in a French port, and be in combat within days. A logistical miracle the Germans could never match. At Arracourt, that adaptability saved lives. Crews used every trick learned through months of combat, firing smoke shells to blind German optics, coordinating with artillery by radio, and even using destroyed tanks as cover. In one instance, a Sherman knocked out a Panther, then parked behind the wreck, using it as armor while firing at another advancing enemy. For many American tankers, their bond with their Sherman was deeply personal. They gave their tanks names: Thunderbolt, Ruthless, Cannonball. Some painted pin-up girls on the turret. Others scribbled chalk notes to fallen comrades. When a tank was hit, crews mourned it like a friend. And when it was patched back together, they treated it as reborn. The technological contrast between the Sherman and the Panther was stark. On paper, the German machine was superior: 80 mm of sloped frontal armor, an advanced 75 mm WK-42 gun capable of killing a Sherman at over Yen 1,500 meters. The Sherman's own 75mm gun could barely penetrate a Panther's frontal plate at half that distance. But battles were not fought on paper. The Panther's long gun made it cumbersome in tight terrain. Its engine and transmission were notoriously fragile, often failing under stress. Its turret traversed slowly, giving faster Shermans a split-second advantage when flanking. And when the fog descended, the Germans' superior optics became useless. Abrams' crews exploited every one of these weaknesses. They knew that a Panther's strongest armor was in the front, but its sides and rear were vulnerable. They learned to attack from multiple angles, using the Sherman's agility and faster turret to land the first shot. In the fog, the battle turned from a contest of machines to a contest of nerves. When a Panther exploded, it was a victory not just of firepower but of cunning, the triumph of a smaller, simpler machine driven by men who refused to surrender. Every successful hit was proof that experience, communication, and trust mattered more than steel thickness, and so, as Arracourt burned and the fog lifted only to return again, the American tankers held their ground. Their machines may have been dented, rusted, patched beyond recognition, but they worked. The German tanks, polished and proud, broke under their own perfection. In those crucial days, it was not the gleaming machines that defined victory, but the grimy, oil-stained hands that kept them alive. The battlefield would soon reveal more than human grit and engineering contrast. It would expose two opposing philosophies of war itself, German precision versus American adaptability. In the grand contest between German precision and American adaptability, Arracourt became the ultimate proving ground. Both sides entered the battle believing their doctrine was superior, and both were about to learn what happened when theory met mud, fog, and exhaustion. The tactical contrast could not have been sharper. The German 5th Panzer Army still operated on the traditional belief in concentrated armored thrusts, fast, deep penetration supported by artillery and air cover. It was a strategy that had shattered Europe in 1940 and again in 1941. But by late 1944, it no longer matched reality. The Luftwaffe was nearly grounded, fuel was scarce, and most German tank brigades were filled with replacements who had never fought in coordinated armored assaults. The Americans, by contrast, fought differently. They had mastered the art of combined arms warfare, tanks working with artillery, infantry, and air reconnaissance in tight synchronization. Every Sherman crew knew that behind them was a web of communication stretching back to divisional command. When a Sherman spotted a Panther, a single radio call could summon mortars or artillery within minutes. At Rechicourt, those radios became lifelines. The fog cut visibility, but radio discipline turned confusion into opportunity. Abrams' men used spotters in light tanks and jeeps to bait German units, draw their attention, and reveal their flanks. Once a Panther committed to firing, its position was exposed, and within seconds, the Americans struck from a different direction. One after another, German thrusts collapsed under this invisible coordination. Their tanks advanced boldly but without infantry support, a fatal flaw. Every time a Panther crested a ridge, it presented its vulnerable lower hull to Shermans lying in wait. Every time they regrouped for another push, American artillery rained down on their assembly points, guided by precise coordinates relayed over the radio. To German tankers, the battlefield became a nightmare. The enemy they believed disorganized was everywhere. Their communications failed, their maps were outdated, and the fog rendered their superior optics useless. In many engagements, they fired on phantom targets or stumbled into ambushes set hours earlier. The enemy perspective, recorded later in captured documents and testimonies, revealed growing disbelief. German officers complained that American tanks appear from the mist and vanish before we can reload. One Panther crewman, captured near Rechicourt, described the horror of advancing through fog where the earth itself seemed to shoot at us. These accounts expose not only tactical defeat, but psychological collapse. The Panther was built to dominate through fear, its gun and armor symbols of unstoppable strength. But at Arracourt, the invincible machine met an enemy it couldn't quantify: adaptability. The Americans refused to fight predictably. They used every inch of terrain, every scrap of information, every moment of hesitation against the Germans. The moral angle of Rechicourt lies not in the scale of destruction, but in what it revealed about the nature of industrial war. Germany's war machine had been built on craftsmanship, complexity, and ideology. Tanks crafted like masterpieces, soldiers drilled into rigid precision. The United States fought with pragmatism. Its weapons were mass-produced, its tactics decentralized, its soldiers encouraged to improvise. On that fog-choked field, these philosophies collided. The German Panthers, though technically superior, represented a perfection that could not endure chaos. The Shermans, worn and imperfect, embodied resilience, the ability to function under any condition, repaired by any hand, driven by any man willing to fight. This difference extended beyond metal. The American system empowered sergeants and lieutenants to make decisions on the spot. Abrams trusted his men. They did not wait for orders from higher command. They reacted, adapted, and communicated. That autonomy allowed small tank units to operate as cohesive, intelligent organisms rather than blind parts of a vast machine. As reports of German losses mounted, so did the disbelief in their own ranks. The 111th and 113th Panzer brigades had entered the battle with over 260 tanks. Within 5 days, nearly half were gone, destroyed, abandoned, or mired in mud. American losses were less than a quarter of that. To the German High Command, it was incomprehensible. In truth, Rechicourt was not won through superior armor or firepower. It was won through agility of mind, through men who refused to be defined by the limitations of their machines. Their rusty Shermans, mocked for their thin plating and constant breakdowns, had become symbols of ingenuity. When the fog finally began to lift, the full scale of the battle came into view, dozens of smoking wrecks dotting the ridges and fields, both Panther and Sherman alike. But the balance was unmistakable. The German counteroffensive, meant to crush the Third Army's flank, had instead disintegrated under the weight of its own overconfidence. Arracourt was not the largest tank battle of World War II. It wasn't the most famous, but it was one of the clearest demonstrations of what the war had become, a contest not merely of strength, but of endurance and adaptation. And it was here, amid the charred skeletons of tanks, that the legend of the rusty Sherman was born, a machine that survived not because of its armor, but because of the men who refused to let it die. That legend would soon meet its defining moment, when one battered Sherman, outnumbered and outgunned, faced the storm head-on. September 19, 1944, 6:30 hours. The fog over Lorraine was thick enough to swallow sound. For hours, only the slow churn of engines and the clank of tracks disturbed the silence. In the shallow valley east of Rechicourt, the men of the 37th Tank Battalion were waiting, engines idling, periscopes scanning, hands sweating inside leather gloves darkened by grease and soot. Their Sherman, a machine patched so many times it looked stitched together from battlefields past, was positioned behind a low rise, its hull half buried in mud. Through the gunner's sight, the world was nothing but gray haze. Every few seconds a shadow flickered. A tree, a fence, or maybe something else. Then, faint and distant, came the unmistakable sound. Deep, steady, metallic. Panther engines. The Germans were moving. Through the fog, figures appeared. Faint silhouettes of heavy tanks advancing in a line, their long barrels cutting through the mist like spears. The 111th Panzer Brigade was on the move, confident and unaware that an entire battalion of American Shermans lay hidden in the terrain ahead. The radio crackled. "Hold fire until you can see them. Wait for their flanks." Every second stretched like an eternity. The German formation moved closer, their guns aimed forward, scanning for an enemy that wasn't supposed to be there. When the first Panther crested the ridge, its armor gleamed faintly in the gray light. Behind it, 2 more followed, moving in deliberate formation. The Sherman's commander took a slow breath. "Gunner, up. On target. Fire." The first round exploded from the barrel, a bright flash in the mist. The shell struck the lead Panther square on its side, just below the turret ring. The explosion tore through the tank's thin flank armor, sending it up in a pillar of black smoke. The German formation halted instantly, confusion spreading through their radios. Before the second Panther could react, another shot cracked from a different position. Another Sherman, hidden along the tree line. Flames erupted again. Within seconds, the fog turned orange with firelight. The German commander ordered a counterstrike. But, in the dense mist, his tanks couldn't identify the source of the attacks. They fired blindly into the fog, shells slamming into empty fields and ridges. American tankers repositioned between volleys, using the terrain to mask their movements. Across the valley, the battle unfolded like a deadly chess match played in near-zero visibility. Shermans appeared, fired, then vanished behind smoke. The Panthers advanced, stalled, then turned, exposing their weaker sides. Each time they did, an American gunner was waiting. In one of the most decisive maneuvers of the morning, a group of Shermans from Company C flanked the German line from the south. Using a shallow depression as cover, they closed to within 200 meters, point-blank range for a tank battle. When they opened fire, the Panthers didn't stand a chance. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Explosions rolled across the fog-shrouded fields. Flames licked at the horizon. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning fuel and cordite. Crews shouted over the deafening roar of their own engines. At the center of it all, the rusty Sherman held its ground. Its gun recoiled again and again. The loader's hands blistered, his arms numb from the constant rhythm. Shell in, breach close, fire, repeat. Smoke filled the cabin. The commander's voice was hoarse from shouting corrections. The tank's armor was dented and scorched, its right tread damaged by shrapnel, yet it refused to stop. At 07:30, the fog began to thin. Through the drifting smoke, the Americans could finally see what they had done. Across the valley, no fewer than 19 German tanks burned. Panthers, Panzer and armored half-tracks left smoldering in the mud. But the battle was far from over. The 113th Panzer Brigade, positioned further east, began its own assault, unaware that the first wave had been annihilated. The Germans believed they were still driving into a retreating American flank. Instead, they were steering straight into a prepared killing zone. Abrams' voice came over the battalion radio. Calm, deliberate, almost unnervingly steady. Let them come. Hold your fire until they're close. It was a strategy born of desperation and precision. The Shermans couldn't match the Panthers at range, so they would wait until the enemy was nearly on top of them, where maneuver and turret speed mattered more than armor. As the next wave entered the valley, the ground trembled once more. German tank crews, confident from the noise of their own advance, pushed forward in tight formation. They expected to crush an enemy in retreat. What they found instead was silence. Then, a flash. Then another. September 20th, 1944. The second dawn over Lorraine arrived with the same heavy fog, rolling like smoke through the shallow valleys. The fields around Arracourt were littered with the charred remains of yesterday's battle. Twisted hulls, smoldering tracks, and scorched patches of earth. The air smelled of oil and iron. But the Germans were not done. Reinforcements from the 113th and 111th Panzer Brigades regrouped overnight. Their commanders, frustrated and humiliated, were determined to crush the American armor once and for all. They believed they had faced an isolated outpost, not the core of the U.S. 4th Armored Division's spearhead. At dawn, they rolled again. Dozens of Panthers and Panzer advanced in a wedge formation from Lisi and Juvalise, their engines growling through the mist. Behind them, supporting infantry and half-tracks followed, convinced the Shermans couldn't survive another assault. In the American lines, Colonel Bruce C. Clark had already anticipated it. He had studied the terrain, the German habits, and the pattern of their movement. His men were positioned on the high ground east of Arracourt, concealed in hedgerows and behind ridge lines. Their orders were clear: wait until the Germans were close enough to see their crosses. For hours, the valley was quiet except for the distant rumble of engines. Then, at 0900, it began. The first Panthers appeared on the ridgeline, their silhouettes ghostly in the fog. To the naked eye, they seemed invincible, towering, angular, confident. But their arrogance was also their weakness. They advanced in tight formation, unaware that American artillery had already zeroed in on their route. When the first salvo hit, it landed squarely among them. The blast threw one Panther sideways, flipping it into a ditch. Another burst into flames. The column hesitated, just long enough for the Shermans to strike. Abrams' tanks, hidden along the ridgeline, opened fire in unison. Shells screamed through the fog, slamming into the flanks of the lead vehicles. The Americans fired, repositioned, then fired again, the same hit-and-run precision that had worked the day before. German radio chatter became frantic. Orders and counter-orders tangled in confusion. Some crews tried to reverse. Others charged forward blindly, hoping to break through. The fog amplified their panic. They could see the flashes of American guns, but not their positions. One German commander, Hauptmann Fromme, led a formation of 5 Panthers into what he thought was an open corridor. It was, in reality, a low basin surrounded on 3 sides by American armor. When the Shermans opened fire, it became a trap. In less than 5 minutes, all 5 Panthers were destroyed. The German attack stalled. By noon, the battlefield was chaos. Smoke mixed with fog until visibility dropped to mere meters. Tanks fired at shadows. Infantry stumbled into crossfire. Radio communications faltered. The Germans had entered a nightmare, one they had once inflicted on others across Europe. Through it all, the American crews fought with grim efficiency. Their tanks were battered, their ammunition nearly gone, but discipline and coordination held. The Shermans shifted positions constantly, using speed and terrain to stay alive. At 1300 hours, another formation of Panthers pushed toward Rechicourt-la-Petite. They believed they had finally found the American flank. Instead, they met a defensive line of Shermans supported by 37th Battalion Artillery. The first Panther exploded before it could even fire. The second's turret jammed after a glancing hit. Within minutes, the entire assault disintegrated. The weather that had hidden the Germans now betrayed them. Their air support, grounded by fog and low clouds, never arrived. The Americans, meanwhile, had perfect coordination. Radar-directed artillery, forward observers and spotters relaying every movement. By evening, the field east of Arracourt looked like the graveyard of an army. The Germans had lost nearly 50 tanks in 2 days. The U.S. losses? Only 6 Shermans destroyed beyond repair. Colonel Abrams' men were exhausted but alive. They had done what many had believed impossible: outmaneuvered and defeated superior German armor in direct combat. The rusty Sherman, once mocked for its thin armor and low-velocity gun, had proven its worth through speed, cunning, and relentless adaptation. But even as night fell and victory seemed certain, the danger was not over. On the 22nd, German reinforcements arrived from the east. More Panthers, more infantry, desperate to regain the ground they had lost. For 3 days, the battle raged across the rolling hills and farms. Each time, the result was the same. The Shermans fought like hunters in their own terrain, drawing the Germans into ambush after ambush. By the time the fog finally lifted on September 25th, the scope of the disaster became clear. More than 200 German armored vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned in the fields around Arracourt. Entire brigades ceased to exist. The Battle of Arracourt would go down as one of the greatest defensive victories in U.S. armored history, not because of technological superiority, but because of ingenuity, courage, and the mastery of terrain. For the Germans, it marked the end of their illusion of invincibility in the West. For the Americans, it proved that even a so-called inferior tank could dominate through skill and strategy. And for the crews who fought inside those Shermans, the battle would never fade. They had faced the feared Panthers and watched them burn. And another. The valley lit up like lightning. Within 15 minutes, the second assault had collapsed. The Germans lost another dozen tanks. Their formations broke, commanders shouting into radios that no longer responded. American spotters on the ridgelines relayed positions to artillery units, and within moments, high explosive shells rained down on the retreating armor. When the smoke cleared again, the field was littered with burning hulks. The Americans, their tanks blackened, tracks mangled, still held the ground. It was not just a defensive success. It was a statement that the so-called rust buckets could fight, survive, and win against the Reich's best. But the battle for Arracourt was not finished. The next day, the fog would return, and with it the largest German counterattack yet. When the smoke finally cleared over Lorraine, the scale of what had occurred stunned both sides. The once green fields of Rechicourt were blackened and silent, broken only by the crackling of burned steel and the hiss of fuel still seeping into the soil. Dozens of wrecked Panthers and Panzer stood like headstones across the hills, their hulks marking the final breath of Germany's armored momentum in the west. For the U.S. 4th Armored Division, the victory felt surreal. What had begun as a desperate defense had transformed into a masterclass in mobile warfare. Outnumbered, often outgunned, and nearly surrounded, they had not just survived. They had annihilated 2 elite Panzer brigades in less than 10 days. Military reports from the time tell the story in numbers as sharp as the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. The German 111th and 113th Panzer brigades entered Lorraine with approximately 262 tanks and assault guns. By the end of September 25th, fewer than 40 remained operational. Most had been destroyed in combat or abandoned due to mechanical failure and fuel shortages. The Americans, by comparison, had lost fewer than 30 Shermans, many of which were later recovered and repaired. But beyond the numbers, the psychological blow was devastating. German commanders who had once mocked the weak American tank now faced the wreckage of their prized Panthers, defeated not by brute force, but by coordination and cunning. The Panthers' technical superiority meant little against a crew that knew the land, moved fast, and fought as one organism. Captured German officers expressed disbelief. One after-action report from a surviving Panzer captain stated bluntly, "We could not locate the enemy before he struck. Their fire came from all sides. It was not a battle. It was a trap made of fog." For the Americans, morale soared. The myth of German invincibility had cracked. Tank crews who had once doubted their own machines now looked at their Shermans differently, not as underdogs, but as proof of a distinctly American way of war. General Patton, upon hearing of the victory, famously remarked, "Tell Abrams he's the best tank commander I've ever seen," and he meant it. Creighton Abrams' leadership during Arracourt became legendary. His calm under pressure, his instinct for terrain, and his refusal to surrender initiative even in confusion. His men later said he never barked orders. He simply saw what needed to be done before anyone else. But for all the triumph, Arracourt was also a warning. The victory had been razor-thin, held together by communication, weather, and sheer nerve. Had the skies been clear, the Luftwaffe might have turned the tide. Had the Germans coordinated their attacks more effectively, the outcome could have been bloodier. Still, history is written by those who adapt, and no one adapted faster than Abrams and his crews. Their success at Arracourt reshaped U.S. armored doctrine. Analysts began to study the battle as a template for fluid defense, the use of speed, communication, and terrain to defeat a technically superior foe. The key lesson was clear. Mobility and initiative outweighed armor thickness or gun size. In the weeks that followed, as the Third Army advanced toward the Moselle River, the wreckage at Rechicourt was left behind. Engineers cleared roads, salvaged usable parts, and buried the fallen. Civilians began to emerge from cellars, staring in silence at the metal graveyard that had once been their farmland. For them, the war's front line had passed as suddenly as it had arrived. One farmer later recalled, "We saw tanks burning through the fog for days. Then they were gone, leaving only the smell of oil and silence." The landscape bore scars that would last for decades. Tracks carved deep into the earth, shell holes filled with rainwater, barns reduced to rubble. But amid that destruction lay the undeniable proof of a turning point. The German army had lost not just tanks, but belief, and belief had always been its most powerful weapon. The defeat at Arracourt forced the German High Command to reassess its armored strategy in the West. Plans for large-scale counterattacks were quietly shelved. Panzer brigades, once envisioned as elite mobile formations, were now dispersed and restructured. Many surviving crews were reassigned to defensive duties for the coming winter. Arracourt had shattered the illusion that Germany could reclaim initiative through force alone. The momentum of the war, like the fog that had both concealed and revealed so much, was now drifting westward, toward the Rhine, toward the inevitable collapse of the Reich. But before that collapse came, the men who fought at Rechicourt would face one more bitter season, and the lessons of Lorraine would guide them through it. In the weeks following the Battle of Arracourt, reports from the Lorraine front began reaching higher Allied commands. What they described was not just a victory, it was a revelation. The so-called inferior Sherman tank had faced and beaten one of the most formidable armored forces Germany could muster. It was a triumph of systems, of leadership, and of willpower. News of the battle spread quickly through the ranks of the U.S. Third Army. Tank crews who had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy and the open plains of France took pride in what their brothers at Rechicourt had accomplished. Many of them had lived under the shadow of the German Panther, the tank whose very name had come to symbolize death to Allied armor. But now that fear was broken. For weeks afterward, soldiers passing through Lorraine would stop by the wreckage. Rows of destroyed Panthers lay half buried in mud, their turrets blown off, their blackened hulls still smoking in places. It was said that American tankers would walk among them quietly, running their hands along the scorched metal, part disbelief, part pride. Even German war correspondents could not hide the shock. Internal Wehrmacht communiqué, later captured after the war, referred to Arracourt as a catastrophe born of overconfidence. One report from the 5th Panzer Army stated, "Our new brigades lacked experience. The enemy's coordination was beyond expectation. The fog favored them, not us. The German loss at Arracourt was more than tactical. It was symbolic. It marked the end of the myth of unstoppable German armor, the very tank that had once terrified Europe. The Panther had been beaten by ingenuity and discipline rather than brute force. Historians would later call it the beginning of the end of the Panzer mystique." From this point forward, German armored warfare was no longer about dominating the battlefield, it was about survival. For the Allies, the victory proved something deeper, that American military design philosophy, mass production, reliability, adaptability, was not weakness but strength. The Sherman tank, derided for its thin armor, had done what the designers intended it to do. It had been built not to be perfect but to be everywhere, and everywhere it was. At the height of the Arracourt fighting, American repair units worked around the clock, pulling damaged Shermans from the front, patching them, repainting them, and sending them back into combat within days. German tankers, by contrast, watched their disabled Panthers burn or sink into the mud, too heavy to recover, too complex to repair in the field. The lesson was unmissable. In modern war, logistics could win where brilliance could not. The U.S. Army learned from Rechicourt in other ways, too. It began refining its doctrine of combined arms flexibility, empowering lower-level commanders to make rapid, independent decisions. This bottom-up initiative became a cornerstone of post-war U.S. military thinking, echoed decades later in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War. As for the men themselves, their legacy grew long after the guns fell silent. Colonel Creighton Abrams was promoted and decorated for his leadership. His name would later live on, not just in history books, but in the tank that became the backbone of U.S. armor for generations, the M1 Abrams, named in his honor. For the survivors of Arracourt, that was fitting. The battle had not been won by machines, but by men. Men who had trusted their instincts, their comrades, and their training under impossible conditions. Letters from Sherman crews to families back home captured their understated pride. One gunner wrote, "We had no armor worth boasting about. But we had each other, and that was enough." The people of Lorraine, too, never forgot. In the years after the war, the villages of Juvilliers, Les and Rechicourt-la-Petite rebuilt slowly. Farmers plowed their fields around the buried remains of tanks. Children played near rusted turrets that had become part of the landscape. Small memorials began to appear, plaques marking where American crews had fallen, where German tanks had burned, where victory had been secured. By the time the war in Europe ended the following spring, the shadow of Arracourt stretched far beyond France. In Berlin, Allied commanders studying the final campaigns often cited it as a model of mobile defense under adverse conditions. In Washington, analysts at the War Department used it as evidence of the Sherman's value, proof that a simple, reliable tank could outperform an over-engineered one when used wisely. Even in post-war Germany, surviving Panzer officers studied Rechicourt at the Bundesarchive, tracing on maps how the fog, the terrain, and their own assumptions had betrayed them. Many admitted later that they had underestimated the Americans, not their numbers but their intelligence and adaptability. By then, the world had already moved toward its next chapter. But on the hills of Lorraine, the ghosts of Rechicourt remained, and standing among the wrecks, if one could imagine it, was that same rusty Sherman, its once scorched hull now a silent monument to endurance. It had defied mockery, defeated arrogance, and proven that victory in war does not belong to the flawless, but to the persistent. In the quiet years after the war, long after the last turret was hauled from the mud and the last crater filled with grass, the story of Rechicourt remained, not just as a military victory, but as a testament to something deeper in the human spirit. The Germans had entered Lorraine with confidence born of steel and precision, the belief that the perfection of engineering could command the chaos of war. The Americans met them with imperfection, worn tanks, improvised repairs, and a stubborn will to adapt. And in that meeting, the truth of modern warfare revealed itself. Survival belongs not to the strongest, but to those who learn fastest. Arracourt was not about who had the better machine. It was about who understood war as a living, breathing thing, unpredictable, merciless, and blind to arrogance. The Shermans were not miracles of design, yet they became symbols of something far greater, the victory of pragmatism over pride, of coordination over complexity, of human will over fear. For every Panther that burned in Lorraine, a lesson was written in fire, that technology, no matter how advanced, is powerless without the hearts and instincts of those who wield it. Colonel Creighton Abrams and his men proved that courage, clarity, and trust among comrades could turn even a rusty tank into an unstoppable force. Their battle became a quiet cornerstone in the legend of American armor, not celebrated with parades, but whispered among soldiers who understood what it meant to fight without advantage and still prevail. Decades later, historians would call Arracourt one of the most tactically brilliant actions of the European campaign. But for those who were there, it was simpler. A few days of fog, fear, and defiance, when the underdog refused to bow. And somewhere in that fog, one battered Sherman rolled through a German stronghold, not because it was mighty, but because the men inside refused to stop. That, in the end, is the legacy of Arracourt. Not the tanks, not the numbers, but the men, who turned rust into resolve and despair into victory.